Hey everybody, welcome back, and if you're new, thanks for coming by. So, it has been just about a month since I shared my Ryzen 7 Corsair build with you all, and asked for y'all's input on what I should do. Should I swap the GPUs, or not? Well, you all had different answers, some saying go for it, and some of y'all saying keep it as is. I don't blame y'all. Y'all have your preferences, and so do I. But since it was mixed, I did ponder for quite a long time, as you can see, and this is only a short clip of me sitting in that chair thinking about it. Trust me, it wasn't a quick decision, but I did go over all the pros and cons I could think of. Before I go into my decision, I just wanted to apologize for the late upload this week. I was down in Florida a couple weeks ago, and the Gulf of Mexico ate my LG G8X, so I lost a bit of the footage. I also was quite busy over the weekend to edit the new video I took with my Galaxy S21 Plus, which I will say is a much better phone overall and takes higher quality videos. As you can see in this clip, it's a bit grainy, which was taken on my GAX prior to going to Florida. Anyway, let's get back into the Alienware and Corsair PC. So after all my pondering, I finally decided, let's just swap out the GPUs and do some performance testing in games to see how they all compare. I'm going to compare the Alienware with the RTX 3070 in it versus having the 1070 in it, and then as well put the RTX 3070 in the Corsair PC and compare it to how the Alienware performed with the 3070. So let me get these swapped out really quick, get some games fired up, and we will compare the performance of all three scenarios. Alright, that's enough of that. Sorry, I get a little carried away with my editing sometimes, but I actually enjoy it. So let's get into some GTA 5, Dirt Rally 2.0, and Cyberpunk, as those have been my go-to games as you all know, and let's see how they compare with each setup. First, taking a look at how the 3070 performed in Alienware with GTA 5 on max settings, we're seeing we're getting about 90 to 91 frames on average, and a lower 1% of about 60 frames per second. I should have caused some explosions to get more activity going, but I honestly forgot until I popped the 3070 in the Corsair PC. So let's try that out. In the Corsair PC with the 3070, we're only seeing about an 8 to 10 frame increase on average over the Alienware, and a lower 1% is only about a 1 to 3 frame increase. I honestly didn't expect much of a boost here, as the PCs are very close in specs, being one's a 3700X and the other a 3800X, with 16 gigabytes more RAM. After popping the 1070 into Alienware, we can see there is a large frame drop, but should be no surprise being it's a 2 generation old card. However, with 55 frames on average and a lower 1% of just under 40 frames per second, it's doing quite well, and the game is still playable even with all the settings maxed out. So, let's move on to some Dirt Rally and check things out. With the 3070 and the Alienware, Dirt Rally 2.0 is getting about 118 to 125 frames on average, and a lower 1% hovering between 60 and 70 frames per second. The frame rate can jump around a bit depending on the current environment, especially when it has to render the crowd or buildings, and can drop the average FPS slightly. Let's compare those results to the 3070 in the Corsair. With the 3070 in the Corsair, again, we aren't seeing a huge performance boost in the average frames, and seeing about 128 to 130 frames per second on average. However, we're seeing a bit of a jump in the lower 1%, up from 60 to 70 frames per second in the Alienware to almost 90 frames per second in the Corsair. So that's a plus for me there, and kind of showing me where I want to go with this. After dropping the 1070 in the Alienware, we're seeing some decent performance considering it's 2-generation old card, with about an average of 66 frames per second and a lower 1% of 51 frames per second, which, again, for a 2-generation old card, this is not bad for a beginner PC, and still runs fairly new games on Ultra without problems. Next, on to Cyberpunk, which here I turned RTX on and set it to Ultra settings in the Alienware. With this setup, we're seeing just under 60 frames on average and a lower 1% of just under 40 FPS. So it does perform quite well considering RTX eats a lot of resources, and you can just tell by looking at the higher CPU temp, which is reaching almost 80 degrees Celsius sometimes. With the 3070 and the Corsair PC with RTX on, it is getting a bit of a boost. We're seeing over 60 frames per second on average, and over 40 frames per second with the lower 1%. The big difference we're seeing with the Corsair PC versus the Alienware is the CPU temperatures are down by 30 degrees Celsius, which is definitely much better on the hardware in the long run. So, let's check it out on the 1070. Since RTX wasn't around for the 1070, we are just running on Ultra, and as you can see, this is where we see a huge hit on the performance, and only seeing about 34 frames on average, and a lower 1% at about 26 frames. Now, if you turn down the settings to medium or low, you can get quite close to the 60 frames per second, especially on low settings, so it is still playable on the older graphics card. In addition to the small performance gains the Corsair sees versus the Alienware, the RTX 3070 is so much more aesthetically pleasing in the Corsair case, as it fits right in with its flat black color, matching the case and my motherboard, and as well has the LED light and the GeForce RTX logo. The 1070 just stands out in the Corsair case, but when it was in my media server case, as that was my main PC at the time, the 1070 fit right in as it matched the colors of it, and I called it the Stormtrooper case. Plus, I might be able to swap out the LEDs in the 3070 logo for some ARGB LEDs that could be controlled with IQ or Signal to fit in with all the other LEDs I have going on in there. This would also allow me to give the Alienware to my family member, as I mentioned in the previous video about the potential swap, so they can get into PC gaming with a machine that can pretty much run anything, even if they had to turn down the settings, but wouldn't have to worry about troubleshooting, frame drops, or high temps since the 1070 holds up quite well still to this day. Don't get me wrong, the Alienware is a great PC as it stands, especially since the upgrades I did to the VRM, fans, and the CPU cooling, but with the 1070 in it, would be a great introduction PC for someone who has never gamed on a PC before other than World of Warcraft on a laptop. So, did those performance metrics change any of your opinions from the last video about these two machines? Let me know down below, or if you have any questions about the machines, put them there, and I'll do my best to answer them all. As well, if you could click all the other buttons below, I would really appreciate it as it helps me out. Personally, I am leaning to do the swap, and probably the direction I will be going, but again, I want to hear your input after doing these performance tests. Well, that is all for me today. I really appreciate you all stopping by. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and take care.